Welcome to Birkbeck, University of London. Welcome to the School of Business, Economics and Informatics. And welcome to the 2016 Alec Rodger Memorial Lecture. The Alec Rodger is one of 4 lectures that we hold annually in memorial of 4 people who had a significant contribution both to the departments that they were part of, Birkbeck as a college, and of course much wider significance. And you will know, of course, that Alec Rodger was basically the founder of organisational psychology in the UK. We always get extremely distinguished speakers, and today is no different, and I will introduce the speaker in a second. Just to reassure you, we are not expecting a fire this evening, therefore we're not expecting a fire alarm. Therefore, if there is a fire alarm, it would be a good idea if you left. And in all good, as in all good films, fire exits are located there and there and there. So please do leave if things go up in flames. It's my pleasure to introduce Dame Sandra Dawson. Often one says that to list all the speaker's accomplishments would take too long, but in this case it probably would. There are a whole list that you can see on the Judge School of Management, Judge Business School website, but I will just pick out a few of those to give you some flavour of the person who will speak to us. So Professor Dawson was the KPMG Professor of Management Studies at Judge Business School for 18 years, and she directed the school from 1995 to 2006. Prior to joining the Judge, she was Professor of Organisational Behaviour and Deputy Director of the Management School at Imperial. Between 1999 and 2009, she was also Master of Sydney Sussex College and served 4 years as Cambridge's Deputy Vice-Chancellor. She's held many positions both in the business world and in the non-profit world. She is a non-exec director of the TSB and of Winton Capital Management. She was on the Prime Minister's Council of Science and Technology, served on the Financial Services Authority, was chair of the Executive Steering Committee for the ESRC AIM initiative, and to serve twice on the research assessment exercise for the Business and Management Studies panel. She was, in fact, the 53rd person to be inducted into the International Women's Forum Global Hall of Fame, and has been awarded the title of Companion of the ABS by the Association of Business Schools. And all this culminated in her being made a Dame of the British Empire in recognition of her contribution to higher education and management research. It's perhaps appropriate. We've seen lots of aspects of leadership in the last couple of weeks. There's no doubt that people like David Cameron and Boris Johnson, Michael Gove, Andrea Leadsom, Jeremy Corbyn, Nigel Farage have all offered us glimpses into how you should organise something or other. Not a country, not an important decision, and certainly not the aftermath. So I think they probably have quite a lot to learn. It's a pity none of them could be here today, even though many of those that I've named have nothing to do now. Therefore, it is my pleasure to introduce the 2016 Alec Rodger Memorial Lecture, From Weber to Where, and Professor Dame Sandra Dawson.
Well, thank you very, very much indeed for that exceptionally grand introduction. I'm sorry the reality is just here before you. I'm delighted and honoured to give this lecture with so many illustrious predecessors. When I looked at the list of people who've been before me, I realised what a great institution this is and how honoured I am to be here this evening. It's also an opportunity to remember Alec Rodger, the founder of the department, as you say, the founder of occupational psychology within the UK, and his seminal work on psychological principles in selection and assessment. And also, in the spirit of complete disclosure, it allows me to connect in a very personal way with this department, which I've known for years, mostly at one remove. I've encouraged students to study here. I've employed graduates from here. I have wondered at the very wonderful royalties that have come my way, because for years they had my book as a recommended text. So for all those reasons, I'm extremely pleased to be here, and thank you very much for the invitation. Now, I've chosen this title, From Weber to Where, and someone said as they came in, which Weber? And I said, surely there's only one. Let us see if the one I have is the one that all of you thought it might be. But why did I choose this title? I chose it because I like alliteration, 2 W's. I like asking questions, and I like leaving lots of room for manoeuvre until the night so that I can determine what it is that I'm actually going to say. But more importantly, I chose it because it implies a journey. And I'm going to talk today from the spirit of 2 journeys, interconnected. One of them is my own personal journey through management studies, which began in 1969 in Imperial College, where I was interviewed by Joan Woodward and Dorothy Wedderburn. And I was recruited then in 1969 on a 1-year research appointment. Just 1 year I was going to spend in this subject, to join what was then the Industrial Sociology Unit at Imperial College. Incidentally, as indicated, I actually stayed 26 years, but I thought it was just a 1-year little dip into a subject. And what I discovered in that year is what's actually sustained me throughout from that day to this, which is a complete fascination with the way organizations work, with the way in which people rise and fall in leadership positions, and with the fact that I'm still learning and still have so many unanswered questions. Now, Joan and Dorothy were building the subject of industrial sociology, coincidentally, when Alec Rodger was working his magic here in Birkbeck with the foundation of the Occupational Psychology Masters and Department. And in honouring our forefathers, or in my case, you might say our foremothers, we might just digress to make a comment on the great achievements of Joan and Dorothy as women. Look here at your 1958 class. I did. There is one woman, she's number 13, but they're not altogether sure of her name. She is perhaps Erica Scorer, ? Now I'm pleased to say I then looked at the website for today, and I find that nearly 40% of your faculty are women. 5 out of 13, there may be more. You may be able to tell me even more. So that's a good journey, not yet quite far enough, but a good journey. Now, my personal journey through research and through my practice in various roles, as we heard, both in terms of leading academic institutions, in terms of researching organizations, and in terms of non-executive directorships. I'm going to draw out some themes, but before, let's have a look at the array of organizations in which I've had the privilege to work, and in which, as I say, I'm still learning, still discovering things about the way they work. So, journeying through organizations, I began by doing a study of occupational health and safety in the chemical and construction industry. I worked a lot in the chemical industry, and these sort of plants were very familiar to me. Through a chance encounter at Imperial, when we were doing the very first merger between a University of London college and a freestanding medical school, a landscape which is now completely changed. We did a merger with St Mary's as the first of those. And that opened up 20 years of work within health, within medicine, and the way in which those organizations work. Enormous privilege to work with a number of NGOs, with Oxfam, with UN agencies, and particularly with UNICEF. This is taken in southern Ethiopia. working in community development or observing and encouraging and studying community and economic development in emerging economies. A lot of work around the boardroom, more work on women's cooperatives, this time in Myanmar, Cambridge in the great tech ecosystem, wonderful opportunities to work with many startups, many technology-based organizations, general office work, the way in which it's organized now in terms of open plan offices, looking at the way they work. And lastly, a personal picture reminding me of construction and engineering, which is where the first 10 years of my life in terms of organizations was spent. This was taken a couple of years ago in a slot which will never be seen again, because it's actually at the bottom of the extension to the new Panama Canal. It's now filled up with water. And we were looking at the way in which major infrastructure projects in emerging economies can work. So my own journey, in which I've wool-gathered thoughts and ideas, you might say that each journey contributes an element. You could say a stone or a stream, a cloud or a storm, a leaf or a tree in the contemporary landscape of leadership, management and organization. And by the time we get to the end of the journey here this evening, I'll have identified 6 landmark thoughts which have become increasingly important to me in understanding the way in which organizations work. Now the second, so there's a personal journey about discovery, about understanding what makes for effective leadership and what doesn't. There's also a journey through ideas and theories, through the dominant paradigms which have characterized approaches. Some might say fads and fancies, but they need to be more dignified than that, which have filled many bookshelves and pages of a wide variety of journals and magazines, and which seek to apply the ideas developed through research and experience to let us all know how to be better at achieving the goals of organizations, or at least the goals of those who are in charge. And a key question for both my personal journey and the journey through ideas and theories is how to advance our knowledge about leadership and management, and then how to translate that knowledge into practice to improve management and leadership for the actors and for the organizations. And that takes me to the beginning of the journey of this lecture and to this man. It is indeed, to me, the only Weber. It is Karl Emil Maximilian Weber, Max Weber, a brilliant and highly productive thinker who had, sadly, a very, very troubled life. But he asked a fundamental question, a question which I remember as that young industrial sociologist in 1969 reading and thinking about. And it is a question which I would say I think about, certainly I think David Cameron would think about, maybe not Nigel Farage, but David Cameron, and maybe not Jeremy Corbyn. You'll have to see what the question is just now. But many people need to ponder, and I'm going to take that as my starting point, because the question that he asked was, how do you bridge the gap between the ruler and the ruled? How do you bridge the gap between those with power and those with less power? So before you immediately say, but organizations are no longer hierarchical, it's no longer clear, we've got flatness, we've got networks, we've got partnerships, but I have yet to come across in my journeys organizations or informal gatherings where there isn't at a particular time anyway those who have more power and those who have less power. And the question is, how are those with more and those with less going to work together in collective action to achieve something, to achieve some goals? This, I think, is a profound question, which doesn't necessarily, as I say, imply a hierarchical system of government. It was profound in Weber's day, but certainly in history, and to an extent in his day, and you might say to an extent today, force, coercion, even sadly slavery were, and perhaps are, options. Force, coercion, slavery. They were, or perhaps are, options. But in an age of emerging, for Weber, albeit limited democracy, and experience of the beginning of large-scale rational organizations in the state and in industry, it was notable even to him, and certainly it must be notable to us, that there is an element of voluntarism, of choice and democracy. That in most organizations, except for those characterized by slavery, force and coercion, there is the opportunity, perhaps, to walk away. So how do you get the collective action? How do you bridge that gap? Now, he outlined three ideal types. He outlined charisma, that is the authority of the force of personality or sacred divinity. Secondly, he outlined tradition, the monarch, perhaps a dwindling number of CEOs, perhaps a dwindling number of founders of family business, perhaps, guisedly, some people may think masters of Cambridge colleges have traditional power. My experience would tell a completely different story on that count. But tradition can provide a basis for bridging the gap. So you can bridge the gap with this extraordinary, charismatic, magic, and sacred divinity. You can bridge it through tradition, because the person who has held that office always does command, or you can you can bridge it through a legal framework, through the law, through systems of rules and procedures, with everyone having their place in a formal order, and in which power and authority are built into that order. In other words, a bureaucracy. So you could have charisma, tradition, or bureaucracy. And although he more or less said that bureaucracy was really the best. He qualified it, he spoke in ideal types, he admitted that they weren't mutually exclusive, and whilst for him bureaucracy was the best form, a pretty good answer for him, he knew it wasn't the whole story, and those of us who were early in our lives reading Gouldner or Selznick or Merton will know that we could catalogue the whole reasons why it's not the whole story. For example, the role of informal organizations, counteracting, facilitating subcultures, above all, unanticipated consequences of bureaucracy, the possibility of trained incapacity, people doing the job so that they can only do a little job and they become completely incapable of doing anything else, a lack of flexibility, a lack of creativity. We all know the reasons why bureaucracies are problems. But on the other hand, they do provide an orderly framework. So his answer in how do you bridge the gap between the ruler and the ruled directs our gaze at the role of bureaucracy, at the critical place of formal organization and associated systems of controls, procedures, and structures. I want to now very quickly take you through that journey I promised you of the history of ideas and thoughts within the bureaucratic framework, within the framework that Weber, in a sense, bequeathed us, and look at the way in which, over a century, there have been a number of approaches to bridging the gap. Those of us who travel on the Underground, they were all told to mind the gap, we have to bridge it, and the century of Western approaches to bridging the gap, I'm just going to whistle-stop through. I say Western because in another part of my life, I am sad that so much of our work now, organizations critically don't emerge or live in the West, that we still have a very Western view. But nonetheless, that's what we've got. So let's see where we're going to start. Well, I'm going to start with 1910, and I'm going to go on to 10. You're all good students of this college, so you will understand. I can speak in shorthand. We'll begin with Taylor. We'll begin with scientific management. There's one best way to organize. The man, always a man with a stopwatch, will be able to optimize task performance. We'll pay differently in terms of piecework. We'll emphasize the technical, the rational, the machines and classical market approach. Think of Henry Ford. Think of the extraordinary power of that particular approach as a way of bridging the gap. You have a very clear, rational system. But we know the story of the Hawthorne experiments. We know that what began as original physical studies revealed that there were psychological and sociological aspects to work, that teamwork, that participation, that loyalty, that cohesion would be important. And we know that cohesion could be a double-edged sword. It could lead, as happened for the select group of women who were so proud to be selected as a special subject within the Hawthorne works, that it could lead to them being thoroughly committed to the organization and increasing their productivity, whatever happens. And we also remember the men who decided that management were up to no good and were just trying to increase they were just trying to increase the amount of work they did for the same amount of money, who wouldn't cooperate at all. So suddenly, scientific management doesn't work so well. So let's think about the social and psychological aspects. We then have a whole raft of work on human relations, or indeed organizational and occupational psychology, on which this department was founded. A sensitivity to the social and psychological needs of workers, increasing productivity through recognition and other intrinsic rewards, what Alec Rodger did, the use of psychological testing, opportunities for social interaction, social and psychological aspects become critically important in thinking about how to bridge the gap. No longer just the machine, no longer just the physical arrangements, but the social and psychological arrangements as well. And then further on we come, and the great growth of industrialization and a feeling that the gap that needed to be bridged was getting too extended, and anyway there was a need for the organization of labor, the beginning of trade union membership, the coming of collective bargaining, and the growth of labor market economics. About this time came the ideas that anyway all these individual things are as nothing, because it all depends. It depends on the technology, it depends on the market, it depends upon the internal culture, and in fact that was exactly where we in Imperial founded our work, following on from particularly Joan Woodward's work on technology and organization. Then we move on and we have people who say, yes, but we're not quite thinking enough about strategy. We're not really paying attention to the resources available. And so we need to have a resource-based view of competitive advantage, especially important because of knowledge intensity and the importance of human and social capital. And the development of human resource management, a focus on individual talent and commitment, elaborate systems of motivation and retention, and yet still, with every idea and theory which has very good opportunities for application, every one of them, you have the opportunity to say, but, how about? And then an unanticipated consequence comes in. I could go on, and this is very familiar, I'm sure, to all of you who will have spent at least a little of your time thinking about these Western approaches. And now, because for the reasons of time, we could equally talk a lot about now the flatter aspects of organization, the networks, the need to build trust as a basis for bridging the gap, the importance of partnership, about which I'll say a couple of minutes, the importance of diversity and inclusion, because there isn't a concentration of ideas in any one place, the vital importance of employability, how social movements are going to work into this, and all of those beg questions about leadership. They say, well, we've got all these different approaches, and now we're looking at organizations sometimes in a flatter sort of way, but how do we actually galvanize people to go, with you on difficult journeys? How do you galvanize the engagement of people, where there's something there about leadership? There's something about individuals or groups of people who are vitally important in injecting into the structures that we have a capacity to lead and to get going. I've just got a very quick slide now on this sort of crowded end of the slide, because I am strongly of the view that talking about bridging the gap between the ruler and the ruled, between the leader and the led, applies equally in these sort of organizations. And so I've just got a few just to demonstrate that. So bridging the gap I regard as still important without formal hierarchy. You only have to look, for example, at Crossrail, Europe's biggest infrastructure project, a 73-mile railway line, £15 billion worth of funding, put in place in 2007 with a multiplicity of funders and of operators. It involves a partnership of the government, the Mayor of London through Transport for London and the Greater London Authority, the operators, the fares the Crossrail passengers will pay, a government grant through the Department of Transport, and London businesses with the help of the City of London Corporation, not to mention Heathrow Airport Holdings, Canary Wharf Group and Berkeley Homes. Imagine! There is a collective of all those people where the state and groups where the stakes are high, and yet there is a need for leadership within that collective if this infrastructure project is to be brought in vaguely on time and to budget. All the work I do in health emphasizes the importance of interdisciplinary teams and getting effective leadership in that context. This is a housing partnership, which is a partnership, it's in the States actually, but it's a partnership of care providers, of physical construction workers and local social care. And a very vibrant housing partnership in which there is in a way a sharing of authority and yet very, very clear leadership. This is an extraordinary dance company which I sadly don't have time to dwell on, but where they work in a collective capacity, where they work with invited choreographers, and yet they need to bridge a gap in order to get a sense of direction. This reminds us about the science and discovery centres. There are now, 60 science and discovery centres, which are partnerships of museums, festivals, learned societies, environmental organisations, universities, schools, outreach organisations, and all grouped together. There's no formal authority, but there is a structure in which there has to be a gap which is bridged, and that gap is bridged by leadership. And in the commercial world, Procter & Gamble, par excellence, does an extraordinary work of partnering with a whole number of enterprises and individuals in their supply chain in order to increase their capacity both for innovation and for productivity. So on my journey thus far, we come to my first landmark. This is the first landmark on my journey, the first landmark which I anticipated in introducing contingency theory, which is there is no one best way. It's good to write books that say do this and you will succeed. It's wonderful. But if those books offer unilinear, single versions, then unless there's no one best way, I would be very suspicious. Because, as I've indicated, I hope, historical and contemporary context frame decisions and trends in how best to engage with people and design organizations. Context is all important. It would be impossible for me to work in southern Sudan or in East Coast America or down in the city or in Cambridge, if I believed that the way to bridge the gap was going to be subject to the same exactly ways of behaving. One needs very strongly to be so framed by the context and of history and of the present. But that doesn't mean that I'm a determinist, not at all. The context sets a framework. The context indicates where it is you need to look and how you need to lead and to manage. But it does not take away from us our role and our responsibility. So my second landmark is that decisions are framed by context, but we have choices. We have choices, and this is, if you like, the sociological conundrum of structure and agency. Decisions are framed, we have choices. I've taken the text for this lecture as Weber, so I thought, well, you know, as in young student days, we always had Marx, Weber, and Durkheim. I haven't got Durkheim in here, but I've now got a quote from Marx in respect of this. It's that very well-known quote, "Men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past." So important that it doesn't mean that the context tells you all. The context is the context, and then we are the players on that context. And given our time, and given our era rather than the time, given our era, and given the opening remarks about the nature of our political context, I just thought it would be worthwhile reminding us what contemporary leaders face, what all of us face if we are attempting to chart a path for the organizations which we lead, or if we're researchers trying to understand those organizations. What would I pick out? Well, it's an overflowing bag. One can pick out the global markets. One can pick out regulation. One can pick out the changing political landscape of the world. This is the present Chinese ruling elite coming into power. One can pick out urbanization. One can pick out religion. One can pick out social movements, here the anti-capitalist movements. Above all, one can note the profound impact and landscape created by the revolution in communications. One can pick out the whole matters of trade, local, regional, global, all at once. The quinoa farmers here in their cooperative can have their quinoa now on the shelves of my local Sainsbury within about 5 days. One can identify partnerships working over boundaries. One can identify food security, climate change, science, technology, innovation, global health, poverty and inequality, terrorism, Brexit, global brands and products, demography, and with demography, identity, a current sense in many parts of the country and the world of alienation, and yet the striving for community. That is an extraordinary landscape on which to try to lead one's organization, one's university, one's company, one's charity, one's UN agency. It is frightening and yet extraordinarily full of opportunities. But unless we have that profound understanding of the context, I would suggest we can do very little in bridging the gap in our own organizations. And so that takes me to my third landmark, which is that whilst I'm a good student of Joan Woodward, and whilst she taught me that markets and technologies are very important, I know that context includes emotions, it includes culture, it includes interests, and it includes politics. These are what are sometimes called the soft aspects. Do they really matter? Do they really matter? Isn't it all about markets? Well, I suppose the Remain campaign in Licking Its Wounds might know that it's a lot about emotion and not necessarily directly so much about markets and technologies. But of course, we can't dismiss either of those. We have to take them all together. So, is there any synthesis at all? We can say that that macro context creates threats and opportunities, complexities and uncertainties. We can say that it raises ethical issues for executives and leaders and researchers, which perhaps we can talk about in the Q&A. And it still begs, in many ways, the bridging the gap question. In the digital age, in the age in which there is fast communication, and yet that communication can be seen to be detrimental as well as positive and will be used differently by different interests. So the question is, well, what can be done? I've got 3 things. I just selected 3 things about what we can do and what we need to both study and, if we're leaders, to try to instill in our organizations. The first is to understand that we're still learning, that to rigorously and regularly examine our assumptions, to ask questions, to show curiosity is fundamentally important. My adult children roared with laughter when I came out of a meeting in a particular organization just after the referendum result, and they said, well, how did that go? And I said, well, we've got to redo our projections. To which they roared with laughter and said, redo your projections. What a stupid way of going on. Of course you've got to do that, but you've got to do so much more. So we need all the time to rigorously and regularly examine our assumptions. And I think as teachers, I think in these classrooms, that's one of the most important things that we can give to our students, which is not the answers, because as I said, the answers change with context, but with that questioning, that curiosity. Secondly, though, we mustn't forget. We can't be so busy examining our assumptions that we forget where we're going. And so the clarity and focus on results, that duality of being open to the new and yet clear, and the unexpected, and yet clear on where for the moment we're going until we re-examine our projections and then perhaps redo what we're doing. And we must appreciate the real value and challenge and ask where they are in our organizations of innovation and creativity, of risk and reputation, of being much, much more alert to the way in which we need to approach risk. It's not some dry old risk register that you do once a year and you stick on the shelf. It's a living and vitally important set of activities in which we not only have material investment, but we have very, very strong reputational investment as well. And because of the variety, because of the demands and the unexpected complex interdependencies, we need to have people who are not like us. What's the good of having 5 other people just like me, thinking in the same way that I think? It's pretty hopeless. What I need, and we all need, is people who are not like us to be able to work together and to work out ways of leading our organizations effectively. So we need to remember the value of seeing things differently, of imagining what it's like to walk in other people's shoes. And I'm just going to show you a really old, psychological, as I'm here, picture. It's this picture. It's the picture we all know and use, and we've known it for 50 years. But how interesting it is that this is just a black and white image. This isn't difficult to interpret. We must all see the same thing, mustn't we? We must. Obviously, it's just a thing. It's just a black and white thing. And yet we know that some people see one thing and others see another. And when we're looking at anything within organizations, we can find that there are elements which will look at things completely differently, and we want to value those. Bridging the gap is never this easy. It's rare that we are going to be working with people who are just like us, and if we were, we probably wouldn't be very successful. So we need to be to learn together with curiosity and with resolve. That's my balance between asking questions and resolving where we want to go. Being to pick up a lot of work that's going on now, being authentic and yet adaptable, and being able to put yourself in other people's shoes. So for now I get to my fourth landmark. Those of you who are wondering, where's the end coming? Remember, I've only got 6. So we're over halfway, more than over halfway in the time. We need to appreciate that each solution is likely to create another problem. And that was a very clear message from my very beginning chart of 100 years. You find the solution, Taylor finds the solution, it's all scientific management, and immediately there's a problem of social engagement, and so on and so on. So we need to find ways of building across boundaries. Now, in the interest of time, I am actually going to, I regret to tell you, I'm not going to talk about this slide. I'm going to go on. So I've identified that the aspect of leadership, bearing in mind my 4 landmarks of context, of agency, of emotion, and of solutions, and nonetheless leadership's important. And we know that there are all these characteristics which are going to be important: establishing direction, developing a vision, securing resources, aligning people, influencing and creating teams, creating and sustaining culture, motivating and energizing people to overcome these barriers, showing courage and confidence, also humility, and then also developing narratives and telling stories. And here I just want to tell a story which comes from South Sudan. And it's the story of this extraordinary woman here, who is one of the best leaders that I know. In a women's cooperative working with Oxfam, we want to encourage sustainable livelihoods, and vitally important to enable self-sufficiency. And agricultural self-sufficiency can be extremely important. And there was a scheme for developing horticultural cooperatives, essentially growing tomatoes, growing courgettes, having a bicycle, using the bicycle to get the grown produce to market, and coming back. Oxfam provided technical assistance, good advice, good training, seeds, and community development. It was a huge success here. It also required fundamental changes in the gender balance in the society, and an extraordinary development of a quiet social movement. Sadly, I haven't got time to tell you the whole story, but this community, it worked like a dream. 4 miles down the road, the next community, it was a disaster. No tomatoes were grown, courgettes withered on the line, the bicycle had a puncture, and nobody fixed it. Why is that? The same intervention by Oxfam, the same intervention, the same project manager even. Everything was the same. And the motivation and the intention was very strongly good. Well, it was a huge change. It was a bigger change here for this group, given the social structure as well as the lifestyle, than any of us have probably had to face. And Elisabetta there, what did she realize? She realized that if she was going to get her colleagues to work with her, they had to really care about what they were doing. And frankly, caring about tomatoes, courgettes, and bicycles was not going to work. Caring about the education and health of their children worked extraordinarily. And so a story, a narrative, a reason was developed. She developed it. She understood in an intrinsically wonderful way the way in which to lead that group so that it was enormously successful. And it is one of the most impressive organizations. There, the gap between the leader and the led, between the ruler, in this case Elisabetta, and the ruled, was absolutely like this. And in that context, as you can see, it was because they had a meaningful challenge and exercised personal choice. And you'll know this quote from Antoine de Saint-Exupéry: if you want to build a ship, don't drum up the men to go to the forest, gather wood, nail it, and nail the planks together. Instead, teach them the desire to the sea. Teach them the desire for the education and health of their children. And this leads me to my own model of leadership, which I hope you can see comes out of what I've been talking about, which is that the self needs to be understood in the context of one's values and purpose, and that others need to be equally understood. And all of that needs to be put within context, and all of that needs to be put within the framework of what it is you actually want to achieve. Elisabetta didn't want to achieve tomatoes and courgettes and horticultural success. She wanted to achieve community transformation and the education and health of the children, as she did. And that clear guiding spirit was something that was extraordinarily important to her. Once again, I was going to talk to you about management, but I'm not going to do that because I haven't got time. But I will say that management is very, very important, but we must not let it be a means of it for itself. As you can see, this is one thing that Weber didn't quite get, because but anyway, so we mustn't be so obsessed with the means. Management is just like leadership. We have to make the right choices that fit the right context. And we have an array of choices about control. We have the hierarchy, we have technology, we have administrative systems, we have money, we have that we can just specify what we want. We have training and codes of conduct, culture, and inspiration. And again, we make choices. We make choices that fit the context. My fifth landmark is that paradox and dilemmas are endemic. One is often pulled in different ways, and one has to make judgments about those. And I just want to illustrate this by saying that in bridging the gap, we are all going to make judgments about where to be on these different dimensions. Between control and autonomy, we can't conclude that autonomy is always good or control is always good. We've got to make a choice between competition and collaboration, between distance and closeness, between design and emergence, between vigilance and trust. That above the line might be said to be traditional leadership, and that below the line might be said to be new leadership. And I say rubbish. I say that actually making decisions that fit the context on each of those dimensions is going to be fundamentally important to the success of whatever endeavor we may have. And so my final landmark is that to translate, to do what I hope I've done in far too quick time, which is to take some of the ideas and fit them into some practice. To do that, you need really firm foundations. You need firm foundations in the ideas, and you need firm foundations in the organizations in which you're going to work. So, from Weber to where? I've given you 6 landmarks. Historical and contemporary context frame decisions. Structure and agency connect over time. Context is more than markets, it's emotion and culture and interest and politics. Each of the solutions we get, we must be humble because we know it's going to create another problem. We have to battle with paradox and dilemmas, and we need the firm foundations of the ideas, even though I've pointed out some of their difficulties, as well as the firm foundations of understanding the context. So, from Weber to where? For me, it's been a voyage in which I've sought ways to identify how we should bridge the gap. That gap is the gap at the bottom of my garden. But anyway, how are we going to bridge the gap? And what I've discovered in these voyages is that I am dealing with an inexact science and an empathetic art. And I don't knock the inexact science. I've contributed to it. It's fundamentally important in what we research and what we teach. But it will never deliver absolutely the way in any organization to bridge the gap unless you have an element of the empathetic art that goes with it. Thank you very much.
You do have time for some questions if I can get the microphone to you.
Hi. That was good. But I disagree.
Good.
So
Ask me a question.
I will. You said bridge a gap, and I disagree. I'll explain why I say that. So I went to this strange college for 7 years, and it was strange. When the maths master gave you maths homework, he would say that, and that questions are solvable using 2 different approaches. You could reach the same answer, but he wants us 3 different approaches. That is to say, he wants us to think twice, not once. And the relationship between what I say and what you say about bridging the gap is that the college I went to was a mixed ability college. Everyone left able with that ability because the same techniques were applied in physics, English language. And you say bridge the gap between leadership, the role, and the rulers. And I say, well, that's not enough. It isn't working. More people, nearly every student, and every student should have that kind of education which reduces the gap. So we don't bridge that distance. We reduce the gap. And our problems perhaps start there because we aren't building up students to be citizens who are able to reduce gaps.
Yeah. Now, I'm very pleased that you asked that question, which I hoped I had dealt with, but not adequately. When I used the term bridge the gap, I said I wasn't thinking simply or mostly about formal organizations where you can perhaps see a gap. I was actually saying that in my experience, even with the most cooperative and flat collective of people, there are at times the emergence of those who perhaps for reasons of getting the job done have more power than those who don't. I made no presumption that those with power had the power because of tradition, because of education, or because of gender. I made the assumption, though, that in all organizations that I have yet to find an organization in which there isn't a gap between those with power and those without, even though those with power may get there because of other, reasons which aren't necessarily conventional ones. So there, that's where the genuine cooperative, where everyone has equal power, I'm sure they will exist, but I have yet to encounter them.
Thanks very much. As one who lived in a housing co-op in the 1980s, I can tell you it's very difficult.
Hi, thank you for that. It was really, really interesting, and your thoughts about leadership. I'm just wondering, if you were working as a management consultant now, what advice would you have for Jeremy Corbyn?
Yeah, I've never been in nor worked in political organisations. Any advice I gave would be entirely personal, which is, I think, that he has lost the trust of certainly some people on whom he needs to depend, and in this day and age, that should tell him what he should do.
Next.
It is quite a little bit different from this, but it's related to, because you talk about the power, democracy, bridging the gap, bureaucrat, history of framework. So American gives the power to authority of the USA, like first women's president of the USA. Your view, please.
Sorry, I didn't quite catch the bit before the USA.
In USA, the next election is going to be
Yes.
the power authority means the first women of the president of the country, the history,
Yes.
like leadership. So, what is your view? Is it possible the American people gives the power authority of the country, USA?
To a woman.
Yeah, first to be the first president of the women president of the USA.
Is my opinion about whether or not that's a good
Yeah.
idea possible? Of course it's possible. Of course it's possible. And I mean, again, that's a choice for the American people. But certainly any country in this day and age, any country can be led by a woman, and should, if she is the best candidate, be led by a woman. I see women are 50% of the population, more or less, and I see no reason why we should not be so represented in all walks of life, in all places.
Have we got a question that isn't about politics?
How is empathy an art?
How is empathy an art? I use that to, I did use it, as you can see, to contrast the science and the art. And so I was using, I suppose, a trope of making a subject of, that science is subject to rigorous research and the evidential base in a rational way. And I think that art is much less subject to that. And I think empathy, which comes, if you like, from the capacity to understand others, is indeed an art. I think, in my terms anyway, it is more an art. It's something that comes more from the soul and from the emotions than it comes from a... We could study and give rules for empathy, and we could sit someone in a room for 100 days and they would never develop the art of empathy. Other people can develop it quickly, and we can encourage people to think about others. I've encountered some people who think that this notion of learning to walk in others' shoes or see the world through others' eyes or understand the position is quite irrelevant to their occupation. And I think they'd be quite tough to get to come round to that.
Thanks very much. Next question.
Thank you very much for that. It's really interesting. And I really liked how you talked about the importance of context and really appreciating context and getting quite a deep appreciation of that when you're facing a problem to solve or a situation to improve. And I wonder if you have anything to say about, in your experience, how you know when you've done that enough. How do you know when you get it and you can move into a mode of taking action or offering advice or beginning to go into solution mode, for want of a better word?
Yeah. I think that's a very relevant question to non-executive directors, for example. And if you sit only in the boardroom, however many papers you get, which would indeed detail the market, the product, the competition, the strategy, you will never actually really understand the context unless you get around and you talk to a whole variety of people. And I've never been an undercover agent except by mistake when people haven't realised who I was. But really going and dipping into the organisation. So when do you know you've got enough? Well, in a way, you never have enough. And that's why I say you need always to be curious, to examine your assumptions, but not forget the duty to act. And so you're all the time both gathering and acting. And I think that it is beholden on you to make sure that you do as much as you can. So that's from a non-executive. From an executive point of view, I think this is critically, it's making sure that you have people working with you who are fundamentally prepared to challenge and to disagree and to say that you've got it wrong, because that's the way in which you'll learn. If you have, I think all of us who've been in leadership positions will have had a few moments of extraordinary realization when you realize you've said something and everyone's leant forward with their pens and written down what you said as if it's an action that they're going to take. And you think, but all I was doing was sort of musing, and please don't act on that. Beware the chief executive that leans forward. And so I think that you, again, beware too much agreement as well. If I feel that everyone's agreeing, of course I don't like too much disagreement either. So.
We do have time for another one or two questions.
Thank you. Yeah, sure. I just wondered, thank you, I wondered what you thought about action research as a method of studying leadership.
Yeah. I like it. I don't like it as, it's quite difficult because you have to be really clear on the role that you're playing and the disclosure that you give and how you engage. So there are some ethical issues around action research. I think that it's more difficult to do now in many more traditional universities because it doesn't necessarily meet the needs of what is needed for some of the more formal sort of publications. But within the mix of research, I think it's enormously helpful, but I think the action researcher needs to appreciate how extraordinarily tough it is to inhabit, in a way, the dual citizenship I've suggested, to inhabit that world. And the examination and the rigorous interrogation of the research needs to be done by teams, I think, of people who really understand the role of action research and will help the action researcher to come to her conclusions in a rigorous way.
Can I just ask about the questions that Weber originally seemed to raise, which were all about how we organise our organisations, how we administer them, how do we regulate them, how do we control them? And that was both an organisational problem but a social problem as well. Yeah. Now, all of those questions were covered by you, but as aspects of leadership. So they would all be dealt with within the organisation. What happened to the wider social questions about the management of the organisations which seem to rule us?
Are you asking there about questions of governance?
Yes.
I suppose, what would I say in my defence? I'd say I had a section on control which I didn't get onto, and I have hours on governance which I won't keep you with. But again, an observation from a too long life is that I used to imagine that the role of chairman or chairwoman was irrelevant, absolute rubbish. I used to imagine that all this dry talk of rules of governance, were they really necessary? The more I inhabit the world, the more I see them as fundamentally important. So I think that the governance arrangements and the need to have it specified externally, if we're going to have effective organisations, is very important.
And how would you apply some of the leadership principles to, say, voluntary organisations? I'm thinking small community groups that have a very specific focus.
Yeah, I think that the management of community and voluntary groups is one of the most difficult things there is to be done. Volunteers are extraordinarily generous with their time and their resources, and they don't and sometimes they find it difficult to work effectively together. And you might say that the role of sensitive leadership, the exercise of the empathetic art, is extraordinarily important there, and relationship building, and also understanding why the various groups or individuals who come together have come together in that particular community organisation is going to be very, very important. But the gap exists, and the empathetic art in its solution is very important.
Just a quick one, like sort of closing the circle and going back to political leadership that Philip talked about at the very beginning. You talk about a lot about the gap, or bridging the gap between the leaders and the lads, the leaders and the followers. But if you look at like politics nowadays, it seems to me that the big gap is not between leaders and followers, but within the followers, or within, if you look at Leave, Remain, you look at the Labour Party, that's like, two halves. Is maybe the challenge, and how do you bridge that gap as a leader?
Well, that's another lecture, isn't it? That's about within big social movements or organisations. There are mini organisations and sometimes quite large sub-organisations. The Labour Party, or maybe 2/3 of the Labour Party and 1/3 of the all of those are collections of people engaged in some shared purpose, and when their purpose isn't shared, they separate off. And the question of how you coordinate collective action within those mini-groups is equally important, I would say. And if I was trying to do it with my colleagues, I would actually pay attention to some of the things that I've said here.
And at that moment, I wouldn't say that we've got our money's worth. I'd just like to summarise what we've said by...
Anyone, why don't you do that?
I'll just go up here. The first thing I want to do is to give you these.
Oh, gosh.
One of these bags has got something that you will predict. The other one is, I bet you haven't got. So, there's a very small present to say. Thank you very much. Yes, do please.
This is the unpredictable one. Now, what do I do with it? It's a way of bridging the gap.
It's a tool, it's a screwdriver that we have, we traditionally give to people who, as a
It's very, very nice, and it's got its own little bag, screws maybe.
It's got several different
screw heads,
fitments to it.
Well, I started life at Imperial College, and in fact there's someone in the audience who was with me at that time, and he will appreciate very well the importance of the screwdriver.
The other is more consumable.
Thank you very much.
I'd just like to point out that one thing that I came out from the talk you just said was, apart from opening at the bottom of the canal, which is something I've never seen in a talk before, and I shall think about, is that you were saying that students must learn to question, and this is something we've really internalised here, and I hope that it's the thing that students, the graduates always tell me it's the thing that they remember about being here, is that challenging and saying, questioning the evidence, and always being out there to ask the questions. So there's a great deal of resonance there. But thank you so much indeed for giving of your time here. It was the most remarkable thing that we perhaps didn't realise, that actually the way in which we select someone to be asked for this is actually a vote within the department, and so that's why we came up with asking you, and thank you so much for agreeing, and so quickly, and giving us such a lot to think about. And I think that's enough from me and from us. Thank you so much for everyone for coming. I believe Dave Sandra is going to be around for a while before we go off, whisk her off for dinner. But there are refreshments out there, and with the chilled wine of unparalleled Birkbeck quality. Thank you very much for coming.